In the upcoming series of videos, we will be exploring Goethe's Faust in considerable depth through the philosophical commentary of Denton J. Sinder. In today's world, the name of this American philosopher is probably not widely known, so before we begin the introduction, it is worth saying a few words about him. Denton J. Sinder, born on January 9, 1841, in Mount Gilead, Ohio, was a literary critic and essayist, and also the self-appointed historian of the St. Louis movement in philosophy. He worked closely with William Torrey Harris, Henry Conrad Brockmeyer, and other St. Louis Hegelians in establishing the St. Louis Philosophical Society in 1866. During the 1860s and 1870s, he was a frequent contributor to the St. Louis-based Journal of Speculative Philosophy, which had significant influence as the first American professional journal of philosophy. Taking his idealist and Hegelian interpretation of history seriously, Sinder later left St. Louis for Chicago in the late 1880s, convinced that the world historical role of St. Louis had passed and that Chicago had become the emerging center of America's and the world's future. He nevertheless remained closely connected with Harris and other figures of the St. Louis movement, and his work, The St. Louis Movement in Philosophy, Literature, Education, Psychology, with chapters of autobiography, remains one of the most important sources for understanding their intellectual outlook. Sinder is therefore a Hegelian philosopher, and although he is not especially well known within the broader field of philosophy, he played an important role in development of philosophy in the U.S. He is, however, perhaps most recognized for his commentaries on Faust and other major works of literature, and in this area his work is, in my view, of very high value. I often read commentaries on great literary works, and many authors have written on them, but I personally consider Sinder's commentaries to be among the strongest in this genre. I would recommend them to anyone interested in serious literary interpretation. These are not commentaries in the ordinary sense. They are closer to philosophical and psychological works in their own right, using classical texts as a medium through which deeper philosophical ideas are expressed and developed within the underlying structures of meaning in those works. A great commentary, as I see it, is one that enters into the inner structure of the text and expands it, opening doors in rooms that seemed closed, and turning on the light so that we can see what is already there but not yet visible. There are commentaries that enter the structure of a work, climb its stairs, but then break out through the window, abandoning the text and replacing it with the commentator's personal opinions, leaving the original work only as background. There are also commentaries that remain entirely within the structure but contribute almost nothing, staying in the entrance hall from beginning to end, repeating what is already obvious without deepening understanding. Great commentary, by contrast, moves through the structure from within. It does not abandon the text, nor remain trapped at the surface. It moves through all levels of the work, explores its inner rooms, and expands its architecture from inside, making it larger rather than distorting it. By commentary, I mean an engagement that follows the meaning already present in the text, while also extending it through thoughtful philosophical development, connecting ideas in ways that preserve the integrity of the original work while deepening its significance into a continuous intellectual narrative. In my opinion, Sinder is one of the best commentators in precisely this sense, consistently achieving this kind of deep and integrated interpretation in his readings of great literature. A central truth in the history of literature is that the greatest works ever written have been distinguished and set apart in a special class. Over time, those most qualified to judge have reached a shared understanding of what represents the highest achievement in human writing, and this agreement is passed from one generation to the next as a guiding principle of culture. Since it is impossible to read every book, or even every good book, attention must be given to a select number of the very best, approached in the most thoughtful way. Even the greatest work can fail to reveal its value if read poorly, and in the present age, the ability to properly engage with the highest literary creations is at risk of decline. This leads to an important question: which works belong in this highest category? Among the vast number of writings produced across time, which have been recognized as the finest, and which have earned the enduring judgment of excellence, there is a growing conviction that Goethe's Faust belongs among the small group of great books that form what is often called world literature. It increasingly transcends national and even continental boundaries, coming to be viewed as one of the foremost literary treasures of humanity. At the same time, it remains rooted in Germany and Europe, standing within the grand European tradition of great works that extends from ancient Homer and continues through Shakespeare, whose legacy it both inherits and develops. Goethe himself, particularly in the later years of his life, embraced the idea of a world literature and expressed it in various ways. The second part of Faust, especially, reflects a vision that reaches beyond its German origins, striving for universality in both its ideas and its symbolic structure. To fully grasp the highest meaning of the poem, however, careful study is required. It presents a series of profound problems that cannot be understood, much less resolved, through a superficial reading. The work is fundamentally divided into two parts, distinct in character yet united by a single underlying movement of thought or spirit, a unity that demands considerable insight to perceive. Within it run two intertwined threads, one human and one beyond the human, working together in complex ways. Their meaning raises further questions. The supernatural, imaginative element carries a comic tone yet ultimately fails, while the human aspect is tragic yet achieves victory in the end. This creates a unique blending of forms, where tragedy and comedy merge so intricately that they may be seen as combined into a single artistic whole. The many issues within Faust are as varied and complex as life itself, yet they ultimately revolve around a single central concern: the problem of the negative. This is not merely a question of moral or religious evil, but one that extends into intellectual and philosophical realms. Mephistopheles describes himself as the spirit that denies, and he occupies a central role in the drama, though he cannot be considered its hero, as he is ultimately overcome. A portrayal limited only to denial would itself become empty and lead toward nothingness. Opposed to this is a powerful counterforce, the striving to overcome negation, the persistent aspiration toward truth even in the face of doubt. The age is often described as skeptical and questioning, yet it is equally marked by its drive to transcend limits in every direction. In Faust, these opposing forces, negation and aspiration, shape the inner life of the protagonist, whose soul moves between them in powerful waves of feeling. In this movement, the character reflects the spirit of his time, as the work itself unfolds through these great oscillations between opposing extremes. Such motion finds parallels throughout nature. Human existence itself can be seen as a constant movement between life and death. Each beat of the heart carries within it a slight step toward its end, and each breath follows a similar pattern. These recurring cycles never fully return to their starting point, but gradually move forward toward a final conclusion. In this way, every moment of life quietly advances toward death. This reveals the tragic dimension of human existence within nature, regardless of strength or vitality. Death marks the end of the long process of change that is life, yet it may also be understood as the overcoming of dissolution itself, a kind of negation of negation. The life of Faust reflects this continuous movement, not merely as an individual tragedy, but as an expression of the broader tragedy of existence. He remains within the limits of finite life, moving between aspiration and negation until he reaches a decisive act near the end, where the tragic dimension is fulfilled and a new order begins. Alongside this negative, tragic aspect stands a positive counterpart. In the realm of spirit, the pattern is reversed. Instead of gradual loss, there is the possibility of gradual gain. While nature does not fully recover its cycles, spirit has the capacity to advance beyond previous limits, continually extending itself. Nature remains bound within its constraints, but spirit transcends them. Life in its natural state is tragic, but through transformation into spirit, it becomes a process of inner development, achieving mastery over negation and attaining a form of immortality. This is seen in the figure of Margaret, who ultimately affirms the power of spirit and is redeemed. Though she accepts punishment and perishes within the natural order, she attains an inner victory through spirit. In this way, she embodies both the tragic and the reconciliatory aspects of existence. In a deeper sense, Faust himself follows a similar path. Though he is closely tied to denial, his journey through the tensions of life leads to a final overcoming of the negative at the moment of death, which constitutes the true completion of his tragic course. The reader, too, is engaged in this same process at every moment. With each line absorbed, something new is gained, however slight, and the spirit extends its reach. Yet at the same time, one step is taken closer to death. In this light, attention may be drawn to the representative element present in all great literature. Such works portray typical figures who act and endure within their own world, yet they do so on behalf of those who read. The reader is meant to undergo these experiences in an ideal sense, gaining strength either to endure them in reality or to avoid them altogether. The life of Faust unfolds not only for itself but for others, offering a passage through the stages of the negative and through the shifting movement between life and death that defines his path. By following this journey in thought, one may be spared, at least in part, from undergoing it in actuality. Yet such a result demands that the work be approached as a form of inner discipline, not merely as an object of artistic enjoyment. In this sense, it becomes a kind of literary Bible, requiring interpretation at a spiritual level and offering a vision of the world shaped by that perspective. This is how Denton Cinder characterizes this work as a literary Bible. There are 4 such literary Bibles that he wrote commentaries upon throughout his life. These are Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Dante's Divine Comedy, and Goethe's Faust. A work of this nature, Sinder argues, cannot be studied solely for its aesthetic qualities. Just as sacred texts are not read only for their poetic language, the ultimate aim is spiritual insight. Similarly, the highest purpose in studying the great literary works of humanity lies in attaining a form of literary spirituality. Their essential meaning is lost if attention is confined too narrowly to historical background, linguistic detail, or even their artistic excellence alone. For this reason, a profound religious foundation can be found within all great literary works, though they do not belong to any single doctrine. In various ways, they reveal a divine order into which the individual is placed, called to act freely, while also reconciling within the self the opposing forces of providence and freedom. Thus, these greatest works may rightly be called literary Bibles, emphasizing their shared role as central expressions of a universal religion. They contain no fixed creed, no formal system, no priesthood or institutional authority, yet they speak to humanity about the deepest truths of existence and the inner life with exceptional power and beauty. In Faust, one can observe elements associated with different religious traditions. There is a strand that reflects Roman Catholic themes, especially visible in the story of Margaret and in the concluding scenes of the second part. At the same time, there is a deeply rooted Protestant dimension, making it, in a sense, a great Protestant legend. A broader tendency toward pantheistic thought has also been recognized within it. Yet these aspects are not final in themselves. They are components within a larger movement toward a universal religious vision, which is embodied in the poem as a whole. The symbolic method that plays such an important role in Faust arises naturally from its subject. In earlier times, belief in a personal devil was more widely accepted, and traces of this belief still remain in certain places. However, a cultivated poet could not rely on such literal belief in shaping a figure like Mephistopheles, whose domain lies beyond the natural world. Instead, this realm of the supernatural must enter into life and take on a form that can be perceived, combining both inner meaning and outward expression. In this way, the symbol unites a spiritual element with a physical form. While the literal figure of Mephistopheles need not be accepted, his symbolic significance cannot be denied. Indeed, Mephistopheles emerges from Faust's own act of denial, representing a process of spiritual development distinct from natural growth. He is a spirit and defines himself as one who continually negates, declaring, "I am the spirit that always says no." Though he arises from Faust's inner being, he is not a mere abstraction but a fully realized character who acts within the world. For this reason, modern readers inevitably interpret him symbolically, as he exists only in that form and was created as such. A further distinction may be made. Mephistopheles is a conscious symbol, deliberately shaped by the poet. This element did not appear fully formed at once, but required a long period of development within the poet's own mind, gradually emerging from an indistinct intuition into a clear and intentional conception. Faust himself also takes on a symbolic character, particularly through his connection with Mephistopheles, who is spiritually derived from him. Their dialogue consistently reflects this dual nature, combining outward expression with an inner layer of meaning. Certain portions of the first part, especially those involving Margaret, may appear more direct and less consciously symbolic. Yet even here, Mephistopheles must be understood in both aspects, as an independent figure and as an expression of Faust's original negation. Without such an approach, the poem risks appearing obscure or even irrational. Ultimately, the human being itself may be understood as a symbol, possessing both an external form and an inner essence, each reflecting the other. The relationship between the self and its bodily expression forms the most basic symbol, underlying all artistic creation and expression. The earliest version of the work, written in Goethe's youth, tends toward an unconscious use of symbolism. The completed first part shows a transition from this unconscious stage to a more deliberate awareness of symbolic meaning, while the second part represents symbolism that is fully conscious and developed. In this progression, the poet reflects a broader intellectual movement of his time, one also expressed in philosophical thought by figures such as Kreutzer and Schelling. In fact, the entire work stands as a major achievement of a vast spiritual movement spanning 3 centuries. This movement found expression across multiple fields: in philosophy from Kant to Hegel, in music from Bach to Beethoven, in education from Pestalozzi to Froebel, and in literature from Lessing to Schiller, culminating in Goethe himself. Within this broad cultural development, Faust serves as a unifying creation that brings together the many dimensions of the age. The immense symbolic structure of the poem is built upon a mythic foundation that was not invented by the poet, but inherited from the cultural tradition of his people. This myth provides the raw material, shaped and refined into artistic form. Just as marble must be taken from the earth and crafted into a temple, so the poet transforms inherited myth into a work of enduring beauty. The story of Faust has deep historical roots and takes on its distinctive form within the Germanic world, where it stands alongside the tale of Siegfried, the heroic figure defined by outward action. Faust, by contrast, represents the inward, reflective nature, yet he too must ultimately achieve a decisive act that leads to reconciliation. In this, the figure reflects a broader historical development. The legend of Siegfried was later reinterpreted by Richard Wagner for a new age, but the story of Faust forms a more expansive and profound structure, one that extends over a deeper current and invites further exploration. A history of the Faust legend, as it has unfolded and reshaped itself across time, is in many ways a reflection of the history of human culture. In its earliest form, the legend appears at the very beginning, and as it develops, its transformations mirror the changing character of successive ages up to the present. Such a history reveals, above all, the enduring nature of the poet's central theme, and may well serve as a fitting introduction to a closer study of the work itself. At the heart of the Faust legend lies the pact with the devil. From this central act arise 2 main directions: the pursuit of unlimited mastery over the world through knowledge, and the pursuit of unlimited satisfaction through the senses. From the outset, there is a shadowy link between intellect and Satan, a connection that remains present in the legend as a seed unfolding over time. Faust becomes a magician, an unrestrained ruler who seeks to command nature directly through the power of the mind, without submitting to its laws. He aims to perform wonders like a divine being while yielding to desire with the abandon of a demonic force. Yet such power comes at a cost. Both knowledge and pleasure demand a price, and Faust secures control over the present world only by surrendering any claim to what lies beyond. The figure of Satan appears here as a shrewd negotiator, dealing in exchanges where the future state of the soul is traded for present gratification. Indeed, it may even be suggested that such a soul is already considered his possession from the beginning, contract or no contract. A legend of this kind depends upon a living belief in 3 essential ideas: the existence of a future state of happiness attainable through a divinely guided life, the presence of a personal devil who threatens that destiny, and a human being who rejects divine command, disregards the promised bliss, and aligns with the devil. Across all ages, human interest has been drawn to such a figure, one of the boldest among mortals. There is something Promethean in his defiance, as though a flash of lightning drives him to challenge the barriers set by divine powers. He seeks to break through these limits and lead others beyond them. Like a titan struggling under a vast burden, he strains for freedom, opposing the divine order. Within the boundaries imposed by his time, he becomes driven to despair, even to madness, until in his frenzy he attempts to shatter those limits, often bringing ruin upon himself in the process. In the older German form of the legend, Faust appears as a seeker, one driven to uncover the ultimate mystery and thus forced into collision with the final boundary of knowledge. He is determined to experience everything, even what is forbidden, despite the force of divine command. To achieve this, he enters into an alliance with Satan. The restrictions placed upon knowledge in his age are not acceptable to him. He seeks to break through them, even if it means overstepping the sacred bounds of religious authority and risking destruction. For him, ignorance is the greatest torment. He would rather face the flames and encounter Satan directly than endure the inner prohibition against knowing. In this sense, the absence of knowledge becomes his true form of suffering. At its deepest level, the Faust legend is rooted in the fundamental dualism of existence, often expressed as the conflict between good and evil. This struggle is as ancient as humanity itself, and forms the central theme of religions and mythologies throughout history. Within Western culture, two major traditions shape the understanding of this conflict: the Aryan and the Semitic. The Aryan tradition traces the dualism back to nature, particularly to the opposition between light and darkness, most clearly expressed in ancient Persian belief. The Semitic tradition, on the other hand, presents the idea of a fall, first of humanity, and even earlier of spiritual beings, leading to a division between God and a fallen adversary. The Aryan element reflects a connection to nature, using physical phenomena such as light and darkness to represent deeper struggles. This perspective continues to influence artistic and literary expression. The Semitic element, transmitted through Hebrew writings, transforms these natural images into a more fully spiritual conception, shifting the focus from physical opposites to a moral and spiritual opposition between divine and opposing forces. Over time, this spiritual interpretation comes to dominate, expressing a movement from nature toward spirit. Religion itself can be seen as an ongoing process of this transformation, refining and elevating human understanding. In this broader sense, the Faust legend extends far beyond its immediate setting, reaching back into the earliest stages of human thought and cultural development. This expansive background is not absent from the poem itself. In the opening scene set in heaven, the fundamental dualism appears in the figures of the Lord and Mephistopheles, who stand in dialogue before the beginning of human action, discussing the nature and destiny of humanity. This conception recalls ancient traditions, including those found in early Eastern texts. At the same time, the scene contains echoes of the natural dualism in the cosmic song of the archangels, who describe the interplay of forces such as light and darkness and the movement of the universe. Yet in their vision, this struggle has not yet taken on the deeper form of spiritual negation represented by Mephistopheles. Whether or not all of these connections were consciously intended, the work reflects a profound insight into reality. To fully understand it, one must follow these implications, tracing the vision it presents and recognizing the depth of thought embedded within its form. With the rise of Christianity, continuing along the same Hebraic tradition, a new and deeper interpretation of the fall emerges, answering to the intensified spiritual struggle of the Roman world. Alongside this development appears a more defined conception of the devil, now seen as the particular adversary of Christianity, though still a continuation of the earlier figure of evil. At this stage, the Faust legend begins to take on clearer shape. Though it still appears under varying names and shifting forms, it can be traced to the conflict between Christianity and heathen belief, the latter regarded as belonging to the domain of the devil. This enemy of the gospel becomes embodied in a single, formidable figure, perceived as a real presence within the consciousness of the Christian world. Around this figure unfolds the great struggle for control over human destiny. In this sense, the devil, as understood here, arises from opposition to Christ. The poet of Faust does not overlook this phase in his comprehensive portrayal. At a crucial moment in the poem, Mephistopheles is shown as emerging from Faust's denial of Christian faith and rejection of its symbols. Yet the devil, too, possesses his own symbolic forms and performs his works within a hidden realm that comes to be known as magic. Thus the poem, in presenting the nature and activity of Satan, exists within an atmosphere shaped by magic, which contributes to its distinctive and often uncanny character. Within the New Testament itself can be found an early indication of both the name and the concept, particularly in the figure of Simon Magus, to whom later accounts of Faust refer. From his name arose two significant ideas in early church tradition, one associated with corruption and the other with magic, which holds particular importance for the interpretation of Faust. The term itself appears to have entered Hebrew tradition from an earlier Aryan source, originally carrying a positive meaning in Persian culture, where it referred to a priest or wise figure. Over time, however, it took on a negative sense within Jewish and Christian contexts. What had once signified a bearer of light in the East became, in the West, associated with darkness and deception. Magic came to represent the arts attributed to the devil, imitating and distorting the miracles of Christianity. In the figure of Simon Magus, one can also detect the origin of a later idea, especially in the German tradition, that the devil imitates divine acts in a distorted way. This notion appears in the belief that the works of the devil run parallel to those of Christ, though in a corrupted form. It remains essential to distinguish between the inward spirituality of Christian mysticism and the deceptive practices of magic, which stand in opposition to it. From the earliest period of Christianity, stories reflecting this conflict began to take shape in the form of miraculous narratives. Among these, the account of Cyprianus holds particular significance, as it presents an early form of the Faust figure. Cyprianus is depicted as both a follower of heathen belief and a practitioner of magic, combining in one person the two forces opposed to Christianity. In an ancient account, he is said to have encountered the devil directly and to have served him, receiving promises of assistance in worldly matters and advancement beyond this life. In this exchange, one can recognize the early form of the later agreement between Faust and Mephistopheles. Yet Cyprianus eventually discovers that the power he relies upon is insufficient, particularly when confronted with the faith of a Christian woman whom he desires but cannot influence through magic. Disillusioned, he turns away from the devil, embraces Christianity, and ultimately dies as a martyr. In his story, the forces of magic and heathenism are transformed, illustrating their eventual submission to a higher spiritual power. He may thus be regarded as an early counterpart to Faust within the Christian tradition. This narrative was later given artistic form by the Spanish poet Pedro Calderón de la Barca in his drama The Wonder-Working Magician, where the triumph of Christian spirituality over pagan magic is vividly portrayed. In this work, elements appear that anticipate later developments in the Faust story. The act of denial, the agreement with the devil, the sealing of that agreement, and the transformation of human passion into a higher form of love. At the same time, the play reflects the strong influence of its religious setting, grounded firmly in the doctrines and rituals of the Catholic tradition. In contrast, Goethe's Faust draws upon a broader and more universal vision of human life and the world, reaching beyond specific institutional forms. Yet it still relies upon the structure shaped by the long development of the legend. The framework, including its religious elements, is preserved, even as its meaning is deepened. Faust begins as a figure associated with magic and continues along a path shaped by various cultural influences, including both Germanic and classical elements. In the end, however, the poem reaches a conclusion marked by spiritual transformation, where figures such as the Virgin appear and the central characters undergo a form of redemption. In this way, the work presents not a narrow doctrinal message, but a broader affirmation of spiritual truth, reflecting the triumph of a higher order over the forces of negation, in continuity with the earlier traditions from which the legend arose. In the 6th century, another legend emerges and develops into a rich and branching tradition, which may be regarded as the clearest prototype, if not the direct origin, of the Faust story. This is the legend of Theophilus, which runs throughout the medieval period as a vivid thread, supporting a wide range of narratives, biographies, and poetic works. At its center stands the idea of a contract with an evil power, now becoming the defining feature of the legend and gathering extensive material around it. The notion of such a contract has roots in the New Testament, whose original meaning reflects the idea of a new covenant. Likewise, the Hebrew Scriptures present themselves as a covenant between the divine and humanity. In imitation of this sacred model, the devil is depicted as establishing his own agreement with human beings, acting as a dark imitator of divine order, a distorted reflection of it. The legend of Theophilus, thus, assumes a form that anticipates the structure later seen in the story of Faust. However, it must pass through a long period of development before reaching the refined expression found in Goethe's work. This development unfolds across three major historical stages, each corresponding to a broader epoch in world history and reflecting the spirit of its time. These stages may be understood as the Faust of Catholicism, belonging to the Middle Ages, the Faust of Protestantism, associated with the Reformation, and finally the universal or secular Faust, which appears in the modern age and finds its fullest realization in Goethe. The first of these stages, the Catholic Faust represented by Theophilus, originates in the eastern regions where Christianity first took root. It emerges before the division of the Church into eastern and western branches and extends across the entire medieval era. In this form, Faust is ultimately saved, and his salvation depends upon his return to the Church. Despite his grave transgression in forming a pact with the devil, repentance allows him to be restored through the authority and mediation of the Church, affirming its power. Other medieval stories present contrasting outcomes, where individuals who refuse such mediation are taken by the devil and lost. In earlier figures such as Simon Magus, one may glimpse an early form of Faust within the New Testament, and in Cyprianus, a version shaped by early Christianity. With Theophilus, however, the figure becomes fully embedded within the structure of the Church, situated within a vast religious hierarchy that claims authority over both salvation and damnation. By this time, the struggle between older belief systems and Christianity has largely concluded, with the latter prevailing. The gods of earlier traditions are reinterpreted as demonic forces, and their influence becomes associated with forbidden arts and magic. The shift in religious dominance transforms the spiritual landscape, placing all opposition under the domain of Satan, while the Church stands as the sole means of deliverance. The central elements of the Theophilus story are commonly presented in a consistent form. He is described as a church official in Odona, in Asia Minor, during the 6th century, belonging to a region shaped by Greek culture. After being unjustly deprived of his position, he turns in desperation to forbidden means. At night, in a place associated with pagan practice, he seeks the help of a sorcerer, often identified as a Jew, and enters into a formal agreement with the devil. This agreement, sealed in writing, promises him power and restoration in exchange for his allegiance. However, Theophilus later repents of his actions. Through sustained prayer and devotion, particularly seeking the intercession of the Virgin Mary, he is forgiven. The bond he made is broken, and the document is returned to him. Shortly thereafter, he dies in a state of grace. This story gained wide recognition among Eastern Christians and was later translated into Latin by Paulus Diaconus, becoming an important part of Western religious tradition. Its transmission into German cultural life was shaped significantly by Hroswitha, a nun of the 10th century, who adapted the story into a poetic form. Her version does more than translate the narrative. It reshapes it to reflect the concerns of her time. In her work, Theophilus is no longer simply a church official in conflict with authority, but becomes a monk struggling against the discipline of monastic life. After his fall and involvement with the devil, he too repents and is restored through divine intercession. In this early adaptation, one can detect the faint beginnings of a shift in perspective that would later become more pronounced. Though still firmly within the framework of the Church, there is a subtle suggestion of tension between individual experience and institutional authority. This early expression, though quiet and distant, anticipates later developments, hinting at the transformations that would emerge in the centuries to come. In Hroswitha there may be seen a prophetic spirit, faintly foreshadowing great things still to come as she rises from that distant Teutonic dusk. Gentle nun, with pale and peaceful face and lowered eyes looking out beneath the wimple in the quiet convent home, what inward struggle of her own soul, what sympathy with the struggles of others, gave birth to that theme. While she dwells in the loneliness of cell life and walks beneath the low dark Gothic arches, she measures the weary hours. Yet what hidden fire must have burned within her breast? In her can still be felt the impulse toward freedom, though smothered under the weight of the stone-built cloister. In her still lives the heart of oak, brought from the ancient Teutonic forest and now enclosed within the pillared convent. After long discipline it will one day break its stone shell and rise again into the free air of heaven. If she could have looked into the seeds of time, which she too had helped to plant, and seen their growth, she would have seen her monk again, her Theophilus, now bearing the German name Luther. Once more he would be caught in the same monkish conflict, though now not merely against monastic authority, but against the whole ecclesiastical world, standing forth from her own soil as the one real man on God's earth. In that revolt he would not sign himself over to the devil, but would hurl the inkstand at him when asked to put his name to such a document. The adamant voice of Luther, using the roughest, harshest, and most sincere of human speech, is silent for nearly 3 centuries. Yet another voice, sweeter, deeper, and grander than any other Teutonic voice, will later sing her poetic song in new forms and in a new world, saving Theophilus again in one last prayer to the Holy Mother. Who can that be? The first true forerunner of Goethe, then, may be called a woman who sang the early prelude of the Faust legend and brought about in song the salvation of the fallen man. In such a work there is a woman's heart, and through it she reveals herself transfigured into an image of divine love, truly a nun fulfilling her mission of faith to her people. From the deepest truth of nature and religion comes the fact that both the Faust legend and the Faust poet were born of a woman and a nun. In the story of Cyprianus also, the saving power was a devoted Christian maiden whose love drew that damned magician and heathen away from evil practices and into the family, not of man, but of God. So the holy Hroswitha rescues her poetic hero, Theophilus, from the grip of Satan despite his rebellion, and with a motherly tenderness leads him back to his good mother, the Church, through divine maternal intercession. Thus the lovely nun herself becomes the German mother of the Faust legend and the spiritual mother of Goethe. Whatever agreement or disagreement may exist on this point, Hroswitha at least deserves the credit of bringing the Theophilus legend to its true home on German soil and of giving it a poetic, indeed a dramatic, shape, the first and lasting form of its life. Yet in her hands it still speaks Latin, the language of the Church. The nun must still speak the mother tongue of the Church. In the 12th century, however, Hartmann would take it up and make it speak German, sending it singing through all Teutonic dialects. From that moment it begins to use a speech it will never lose, one so deeply woven into its inner structure that it may truly be said no other language can fully express it. Another Teutonic mark was given to the legend by the signing of the contract in blood, a feature taken from ancient Teutonic custom, though later used by Calderon. This detail appeared in the 13th century in a German poem on the subject, from which it seems to have passed into a French poem of the same century. With this final blood-written bond, the legend of Theophilus may be said to have reached its medieval fullness on German soil, in German speech, with a diabolic contract signed in German blood. Yet behind all this restless and advancing Teutonism there still hovers the Latin Church, through whose agency alone the defiant German spirit can finally be saved and sent to heaven. From the 6th to the 16th century, opposition to that Church meant surrender of the soul to heathen magic and alliance with the devil. That was the truth of the early German situation. To abandon the Church in Christendom was to pass over to Satan and heathendom, to throw civilization back into savagery, and indeed to lose the soul. But now an anguished cry begins to be heard. In all this great Teutonic body, is there no German heart strong enough to break free from the vast ecclesiastical prison and yet, in freedom, not fall over to Satan? Is it not possible for man to be Christian and not heathen outside the bounds of the Church, to unite self-liberation with eternal holy law and the world order? Such a man has indeed arisen and is speaking. His name is Luther, and through his whole life rings one great sentence. He will belong to Christ and not to the devil, despite the Church. With him a new age begins, marching at its head, and wielding Thor's hammer from his tongue, whose blows strike the old venerable structure until it shivers and splits from top to foundation. The rebellious monk Theophilus appears once more and stands in revolt, but now he will make no pact with Satan, nor will he return to the Church for the salvation of his soul, as the gentle Hroswitha had urged in her persuasive speech. A new age opens for history, for religion, for humanity, but that lies beyond the present concern. A new age opens also for the Faust legend, and that is the present concern, which must now be taken up at once. This leads to the second Faust, the Faust of Protestantism, or of the Renaissance, who now takes his proper German name, though perhaps with a trace of Latin origin in it. He now also reaches his greatest importance in legend, even while faint hints of a historical figure appear behind him. This Faust is not saved. Instead, he is carried away by the new devil brought forth by the spirit of the Renaissance. A brief look at this significant fact is needed. Two outcomes arise from rebellion against ecclesiastical authority. One is Luther, the strong in soul, with his Protestantism, the man who could break from the Christian Church and still remain Christian, because in his own mighty heart there stood God's dwelling place. The other is that different German spirit, which also breaks away from the Church alongside Protestantism, but does not remain Christian. It will not make the short turn back. It goes onward into magic and heathenism and forms a bond with the devil. This is Faust, the twin child of the Reformation and yet its greatest enemy, the new demon born from it, though always showing signs of his saintly kinship. It is as though the Great Mother were always bringing forth two brothers, Cain and Abel, together. The good angel and the evil angel are born from the same pangs, from the same womb, at the same hour. Faust is recognized as the direct descendant of that spirit active in Germany far back in the Middle Ages, the spirit that gentle Hroswitha portrayed in conflict with monastic authority, yet rescued through the help of the Church. Now, however, those helping powers have been attacked and destroyed. There is no longer any Holy Mother whose intercession saved the older rebel. Protestantism has denied her, and Faust lives in a Protestant world, being, as has been seen, its own child. For him there is no salvation, at least not in the old way. Protestantism places the struggle in the hands of the individual, not in the Church's doctrine and ceremony, which under the new light have become magical rites and therefore belong to the devil. The conflict is now a matter of conscience, not priestly absolution. It becomes a personal struggle with the devil, whom every Protestant must see, as Luther saw him, and drive away not by the sign of the cross or by clinging to a rosary, but by flinging an inkstand at him with the full force of the individual arm. O German man, brave champion of the world's freedom, spiritual liberty has indeed arrived for thee, but with it has come the devil, boldly entrenched within thee. There he sits, chattering and grinning, the ape of God, mocking all priestly ceremony meant to cast him out. Thou and thou alone must do that. No swinging of incense, no bishop's staff, not even the most refined movement of the Pope's crozier will drive him away in these liberated days. Personal freedom has arrived, but with it personal responsibility, and that to the harshest master, namely the newly awakened self. And thou, tender soul, the devout Hroswitha of this age, shalt henceforth bear the burden of thine own conscience. For all time it can no longer be handed over to priest and church for safekeeping. In the deepest distress, one must not even think of that, for to do so has now become for thee the true surrender to the devil. In the period now under review, the myth of Faust suddenly expands to immense size and becomes truly all-embracing, the gigantic image of the age. To understand it, one must summon before the mind the character of that century, bursting its boundaries in every direction and making the great break from the Middle Ages. The established and inherited order was struck on every side by a demonic energy, and the human mind rose in mighty protest, fighting a titanic battle against the traditional limits that enclosed and restrained it. First, nature could no longer hold her barriers, but was forced at every turn to yield her secrets to the awakened human spirit. The discoveries of Galileo and Kepler extended human dominion downward upon the earth and upward among the stars, giving natural science, if not its birth, at least its baptism. The discovery of America swept away the immense geographical boundary of ignorance that had shut both antiquity and the Middle Ages away from their earthly inheritance. Through this, the earth was seen as a whole, complete in physical form, becoming for the mind an enduring image of spiritual wholeness and a fresh impulse toward further breaking of limits. Then the invention of printing removed knowledge from the possession of the few and gave it to all, becoming the mightiest and most ingenious instrument yet devised for breaking boundaries. Thus nature was pushed farther and farther toward the infinite, and former limits were surpassed with an unbounded view into future worlds. In the same way, the spiritual limits of the age, the limits fastened upon the mind, were also exceeded. There was the revival of learning, the study of classical antiquity in a new spirit of freedom, the rise of universities, and then the fine arts followed, above all the new poetry breaking its ancient restraints and reaching its height in Shakespeare. The spirit was felt everywhere, and the time was called the Renaissance or New Birth. The mind too discovered its America and rounded its Cape of Good Hope. But the chief of these barrier-breaking movements was the religious one, called the Reformation, in which the limits imposed by the Church for centuries were first questioned, then resisted, and finally cast off. It was a violent wrench that shook the world, the true struggle of the age and the pattern of all its struggles, filled with the daring of the human soul, which risks its destiny on freedom and defies authority, even when it joins itself to the devil. The Faust legend is the creation of that barrier-breaking spirit and the myth built by the people themselves, an image, or vast human likeness, of the age and of their own deepest inward life. It takes on a religious shape, because it rises directly from a religious upheaval. The great issue of the time is not science, art, or learning, but religion. The marvelous structure of the papacy, which had sought to enfold the whole world within its walls, has been split open by the groaning powers inside it, and those powers are battering it down. From this collapse of ancient and honored boundaries there emerges a destroying fiend. Once destruction had truly begun, it could not stop of itself. Protestantism, which first fed it and drove it onward, was finally alarmed by what it had released and tried to restrain it. But in vain. The angry spirit of destruction had seized the soul of the age, and now it began to threaten every religious principle as though each one were a limit on human intelligence. That spirit, heard abroad and felt within the human breast, was shaped by the people into a dark and dreadful figure, endowed with magical power, and given the name Faust. Faust is therefore the man of intellect, of deep study, and of limitless spiritual longing, yet he has turned against the Church and joined himself to its destroyer. Religion names this spirit, so destructive to itself, Satan, a person whom people first feel, then imagine, and finally believe they actually see. To them he is, and must be, the most solid reality. He is certainly a very real being. In that age he would have been believed in, even by those who do not believe now, and perhaps he would have been seen, as Luther saw him, more clearly than most men ever do. Faust must then be understood as the child of the Reformation in its most extreme negative tendency, the destructive force born out of every revolution, however great its blessings. He is that spirit which shattered the old boundaries and now defies all boundaries of every kind, entering into league with evil. Protestantism itself drew back from its own offspring, for it too had to preserve some limits, and so it had to fight the Faust spirit it had awakened. The harshest rebuke ever said to Faust for his misdeeds is reported to have come from Melanchthon, the reformer. In this sense it may be called a Protestant legend, and some writers even call it the only Protestant legend. Along with Faust's devilry it joins, in a strange and alluring mixture, the condemnation of monks, priests, and the papacy. Yet destruction circles back upon itself in the end. Protestant writers therefore portray Faust as at last torn apart by the devil, his own destructive spirit bringing about his ruin. The name Johannes Faust carries a faint trace of historical reality. Some of the details told about his life appear to have the ring of authenticity, but he is hardly more than the historical kernel around which the legends gather, full of the convulsions of the age, growing into enormous and grotesque shapes. Wittenberg, the spiritual home of the Reformation, is also the spiritual home of Faust's double discipline. There he studied theology under the great reformers, and there too, in a wood not far from the town, he made his first pact with the devil. Around Wittenberg, as a center, many Faust legends are woven, following the true instinct that links the spiritual origin of Faust with that of Protestantism. From that center, he moves across all Germany, accompanying the new doctrine like its dark shadow. Then he passes from Germany into many lands of Europe, carrying his arts along with a great movement that is stirring the world, the never-failing counterpart of the Protestant message. In that age of ferment, he has a universal meaning. He goes even to Rome, still the great spiritual center, and not only in the Protestant Church but also in the Roman Church. The Renaissance and its illumination produced demons, ecclesiastical and even papal, reaching their culmination in Borgia. After Faust's death, which probably occurred a little before the middle of the 16th century, his fame begins to appear in a series of Faust books that claim to tell the story of his life and adventures. These books, however, are the great storehouses of the legend, especially the first one, printed at Frankfurt in 1587 and usually known as Spies Faust book. In it, the myth-making spirit of the age shows itself in its wildest and most grotesque forms, while a mighty and serious struggle of the spirit twists through the strange shapes of Gothic imagination. Indeed, the Faust legend becomes a vast whirlpool, drawing into itself the mythical treasures of distant Teutonic, and even distant Aryan, antiquity. Even the cautious Loper says that the pact between Faust and Mephisto finds its true prototype in the relation between the old German gods, Odin and Loki, the latter of whom was also lame. Vulcan, the Greek god of fire, was lame too, and may well have helped shape the lameness of Mephisto, whose proper element is also flame. Even in Persian Firdousi, a Faust legend has been found in the story of the tyrant Sohak and the evil spirit Iblis. Such comparisons between myths are interesting and fruitful up to a certain point, but they can easily lead to excess. Comparative mythology becomes badly unbalanced when it tries to explain the Faust poem. Still, in a general way, it may well be believed that the old gods, long suppressed by their Christian enemies, begin to reappear in this new man who is hostile to Christendom. The secret underground stream of heathenism, arising from the earliest beliefs of the human race and still flowing deep in the instincts of the people, suddenly bursts into the light and rushes violently around this new hero, who is himself essentially heathen. In Spies' first Faust book, Faust's fall is expressly compared with the fall of the giants in Greek mythology, of whom the poets sing that they piled the mountains together and made war on God. These Faust books carry on their surface a clear intention. They are admonitory throughout, apparently composed by Protestant theologians to warn the people against a new spirit. That spirit first appears in the figure of a student of Christian theology who, desiring to explore all the deeps in heaven and earth, is compelled to summon the aid of the devil. In these writings, Faust consistently serves as the awful example, from which moral lessons are drawn and sermons constructed, often decorated with grim Gothic terrors. In Widman's Faust book and similar works, long theological discussions are attached to the chapters, along with practical warnings and moral applications, forming a kind of commentary upon what is effectively a Bible of Satan. The dominant literary tone is an unconscious, exaggerated humor that occasionally breaks through the surrounding layers of superstition and heaviness, like a thin stream of laughter across vast stretches of darkness. Despite their warning purpose, these books could not prevent the figure of Faust from being embraced by the popular imagination. His story spread through all forms of popular expression, tales, drama, and puppet plays. In fact, the Faust books themselves, while meant to discourage admiration, inevitably strengthen fascination for this bold and defiant spirit, the very energy unleashed by Protestantism, which could not suppress it on earth and therefore cast it into hell. The same daring impulse admired in Luther was also admired in Faust, a double defiance that challenges not only Catholicism but even damnation itself. These Faust books were written in prose, though occasional attempts at verse appear. No poetic figure like Hroswitha arose from German soil during the Reformation, which was more destructive than creative in artistic terms. The only truly poetic work associated with the Faust tradition in this period appears in England, in the dramatic work of Christopher Marlowe. A second defining feature of these Faust books is their strongly Protestant character in tone and outlook. They turn with sharp hostility not only against the figure of the magician, but also against Roman Catholicism, often blending both into a single object of condemnation. Faust and the Church stand at opposite poles of the spiritual world, representing faith and denial, and both are regarded as enemies of Protestantism, which positions itself between them, rejecting both extremes. To this outlook, the ritual practices of Catholicism and the magical arts attributed to Faust are equally expressions of diabolic influence. The narrative often merges the two. Satan appears in the guise of a friar or cleric, while Faust's dealings are associated with monastic or ecclesiastical forms. Even Luther himself remarks that the devil's true disguise resembles a monk's habit. The Mass, the cloister, the priesthood, and the papacy, in fact the entire Catholic system, are treated with fierce rejection, and Faust too is ultimately destroyed in parallel fashion, first within the Faust books and then at the hands of the devil. This connection also appears in Luther's own language, where he describes Satan as God's ape, imitating sacred rites through distorted forms. In this way, the new Christian order treats the older Christian order in a manner similar to how the earlier church had treated ancient pagan belief. Just as the gods of Greece and northern tradition were once reinterpreted as demonic powers and their rituals reduced to forbidden magic, so now Protestantism reassigns Catholic rites to the realm of magic and joins them with the diabolic acts associated with Faust. At this unstable point, the Faust books leave the reader in an unresolved position, suspended between opposing forces, uncertain of direction. They reflect, almost unintentionally, the deeper historical difficulty of the Protestant condition itself, a tension that persists beyond their time. It is as though the protective barriers have been breached and the waters released, yet no controlling hand exists to restrain them. The result is a vast and turbulent current moving through history, upon which Protestant life is carried forward without clear direction. Doubt rises as strongly as the external movement, stirring within those who are carried along. Returning to the former order is no longer possible. The break is irreversible. Instead, life continues within the flowing current of time, between what seems like two eternal boundaries. Within this movement, different responses emerge. One group quickly withdraws from the current and returns toward the source, maintaining a partial form of the old order, though not without internal tension and fragmentation, as smaller groups separate and move independently within it. Other groups anchor themselves at various points along the stream under strong guiding figures, each forming new centers of attraction and resistance. Still others remain scattered in smaller formations, attached to unstable supports, drifting or fastened to weak foundations, hoping for stability and salvation. Seen together, they resemble fragments of a vast wreck, though those within them display courage, endurance, and a deep sense of inner freedom. But the danger is now drawing close, and some have reached the very brink of the cataract that plunges into the dark, unfathomable abyss. There they cling to some accidental branch stretching above the waters, or are held by some chance rock beneath the current. Will it hold? Then comes Faust's boat, rushing in the middle of the stream, flying downward and downward. Halt, daring man, with a heart of triple brass. Does he truly think to race the rapids, that infernal Niagara, and come out alive? A long and anxious cry rises through the whole course of the stream, answering no. These Faust books cry out in harsh German tones, and the entire Protestant world echoes the same no, as Faust's boat plunges into the misty gulf. It is gone, swallowed from sight, lost forever. Never again, many will think, will the man be heard of outside the pool of damnation. Yet if there is a true ear for music and a soul attuned to the harmony of the ages, there will be heard a song rising from those unseen depths, whose message is that the dark Niagara can be crossed and the man can be saved. With that song the third Faust appears, transfigured from his infernal journey and taking his place in the new temple of Goethe's legend. The third Faust may be called the Faust of secularism or the universal Faust, because it is secular universal discipline, philosophy rather than theology, that gives pulse and force to his denial, and because the modern legend, like the life of the time, is surrounded more by secular institutions than by ecclesiastical ones. Where formerly the assault was aimed at the old church, it is now directed against the whole structure of social order. The negative Faust spirit has pushed beyond the religious world and has laid hold on the very foundations of society, causing great shaking and upheaval. Faust appears again with terrible energy in the 19th century, carrying a new idea, a new purpose, and standing in league with a new devil. That new world, America, discovered in a Faust age, and the greatest result of the barrier-breaking Faust energy of the Renaissance, marks the beginning of the new movement in the so-called American Revolution, followed by the French Revolution, the grandest conflagration in the world's history. The social and institutional limits of feudalism now had to be broken down, for they had become too narrow for the new human spirit, just as ecclesiastical limits had become too narrow in the 16th century. It was seen how the devil of the Renaissance was born from the awakened, barrier-breaking intelligence of that age, the infernal shadow that follows the sun in heaven. In like manner, from the newly awakened and barrier-breaking modern age is born the spirit that both denies truth to man and threatens to overturn his entire social and political fabric. This spirit is the modern devil, the Mephisto of the present time, present in all of humanity to some degree, and one against whom new Lutheran energy must be used. He is the devil born from the very struggle to know truth and to make truth real in the world. Goethe has revealed this devil, rising from the deepest culture, in all his changes and disguises, and has thereby given literature the vastest and fullest image of the destroying angel. It was in Germany, the land of thought, that this modern revolution found its spiritual rather than its practical expression. To give it voice, the new German literature and the new German philosophy arose, each among the most original achievements of its kind in Europe since the Reformation, each reflecting the latest Renaissance, each breaking old barriers. Such a period required a new Faust as well, and the man most capable of summoning him was present, the poet himself, a striving Faust in the native land of striving Fausts and barrier-breakers. Yet this Faust is different in many ways, chiefly in that while he destroys barriers, he also builds them again, wider and stronger, wide enough and strong enough to contain the new world order. The devil does not gain him, though he too makes the old pact. Rather, he overcomes the devil in keeping with that pact. It may be said that this Faust, in both destructive and constructive force, embodies the modern man more deeply than any other figure in literature. Indeed, Faust seems to find his fullest possibility, if not his fullest fulfillment, in the Anglo-Saxon man of the present day. That man wrestles with untamed continents and conquers nature in ways never seen before. The boundaries of the physical world seem not to limit him, but to serve as steps toward higher conquest. Titanic striving to subdue earth, space, and time is present here, though spiritual striving does not appear in so high a degree, nor does spiritual victory. He should not be condemned for these shortcomings. He should not be diminished in relation to his task. Rather, he should be admired as he stands under his burden, with giant strength, bearing the weight of his age with unspeakable toil, skill, and courage. Those who write may spur him on, but they are only pygmies with a pen-point, troubling Hercules as he swings his club amid his 12 labors. Perhaps, if they could lift that club, they would be carrying it too. Faust's conquest of sea and land continues, and in it the material transfiguration of this earth is already underway. The spiritual conquest remains, in its fullness, for the future. Laboring Hercules, after completing his earthly task, will yet be transfigured and placed among the Olympian gods. The Faust of the 16th century carries an immense greatness in his heart, a daring without equal that made him a popular hero even in defiance of the clergy. He refuses to accept any limits placed upon himself, and will even join with Satan in order to break free from the narrow restraints of the world. This is a colossal striving for freedom, even if the alternative is not freedom or death, but freedom or eternal brimstone. Yet even sulphurous flames are not felt to be as harsh as a state of mental servitude. He descends while fighting against all limits, but the religious spirit prevails, since it has no plan of salvation that can include such a man. According to the legend, Faust is torn to pieces by the devil. His eyes, teeth, and brains, with much blood scattered about, are found in the room where the final struggle is said to have taken place, while the rest of his body is later discovered in a dung heap. Truly an example, as the pious author of the old Faust book declares. But the Faust of the 19th century will not meet such an end, though he begins with the same negative character. He must continue and work himself out of his own denial. His energy is now directed less in the religious sphere and more in the institutional realm. The activity of the world spirit is no longer confined to the church alone, but extends through the entire cycle of institutions. He is also philosophical, a seeker of truth. He doubts, yet he has a mind and uses it. In this way he conquers his own spectres and overcomes his own limitations, something the Faust of the Renaissance could not achieve, since the devil was too strong for him. The modern Faust becomes a truer image of the human spirit, a free man in a world that is also free, while the older Faust remains tragic, a victim of his own effort to gain freedom. One deeper look into this legend reveals within it the process of universal history itself, the movement within the soul of time, where the working of the world spirit can be seen reflected. If limitation could endure forever, complete and fixed, there would be no spiritual movement and no history at all. Barriers must be broken, even if new ones replace the old, for the essence of spirit is that it transcends its own limit, and thus it may rightly be called the unlimited, undying, eternal. There would be no religion, and no need for it, if man received its forms already made, lasting forever. His glory lies in outgrowing them and building a new world of freedom. This is his highest vocation, to construct a world of freedom. It is the soul of both his age and himself. He must indeed have a body for his soul, but that body is cast off in time as the mortal part. In this way one must look boldly into the Faust legend and see within it the image of the spirit of history itself, whose changes are revealed both in the strong outlines of the people and in the finer strokes of the poet. It becomes a universal biography of humanity in its grand struggle against the evil one, unfolding through three great movements of time. The medieval Faust makes a contract with Satan, but repents in time and is saved through the Church's instruments. The Protestant Faust makes his contract with the same dark agent and keeps it, the daring soul. The devil takes him as he must, otherwise the heavens would fall. The modern Faust also makes and keeps the contract with the fiend, yet by keeping it he traps him, conquers him, and ultimately destroys him in his own infernal pit. A strange and seemingly paradoxical story on the surface, yet it reflects the deepest truth. In the earlier religious world there is no salvation for this new Faust, the denier. Having rejected the old faith, he is cast out into hell, since the system can do nothing else with him, and in that it is not to be blamed, for it offers its sincerest answer. But he cannot remain there. Released by time from his Promethean suffering, he reappears in a new course of existence. And here the central point must be clearly seen. In the very pursuit of truth, he has come to the denial of truth, not through simple fault, but through the strength and sincerity of his spirit, his tireless effort to know what is highest, that he has arrived at negation. Can such a man be lost? Can the age do without him, the sufferer and seeker through darkness? Above all, can such a soul be condemned eternally for its honesty in being honest and its truthfulness in seeking truth? Impossible. That would be the spiritual destruction of humanity itself. For this man, it becomes clear that a new Faust book, born out of the new life, is now required. None of the older forms are sufficient, though they still shed a certain light. Indeed, a Faust Bible would need to be written, if one were to speak the true word. Here it stands, the child of the time's necessity, a writing that is also a song, like all supreme human utterance, set to music that is varied, deep, and full of echo by the latest master of the world's harmony. Under its strains a new world appears to rise out of chaos and night, bringing with it a new, more charitable, more universal religion, which does not cast out but receives even its own denier, a faith strong enough to reach out in supreme charity and save the enemy of faith, a faith so self-centered and complete that it cannot be forced, even by denial, to deny itself. Such a faith, like a rainbow whose two ends rise from the darkest storm clouds and arch over the earth, surrounds this book, where the third Faust is seen saved after the darkest journey on record. It may rightly be called the Bible of Faust, the way of his salvation. This is its meaning in the present age. It is not a mere literary book, but a literary Bible. The work has itself been described as containing something incommensurable, a key word for understanding it correctly. Yet this does not mean it is incomprehensible, but rather that no external standard exists by which it can be measured. Criticism has no fixed rule or canon capable of fully judging it. It is an original poem that must justify itself from within. It must be seen through its own inner light and unfold according to its own law. It is a self-contained and self-determined work, if ever such a thing existed, arising from and reflecting the free human spirit. From this it follows that the historic or biographic method is inadequate for measuring Faust. It fails precisely where it is most needed, namely in explaining the present structure of the poem. It tears the work apart and then tries to restore it, but leaves it in fragments. It dislocates the whole, placing what comes later before what comes earlier, and turns a poetic cosmos into critical chaos. Not chronological sequence, but organic connection is the essential point. The poet has deliberately hidden the former and placed the latter before our eyes as his true method. The poem must therefore be understood as it stands, as the poet left it. Any other arrangement is not his. While biographic study may be useful for tracing how the scenes may have developed in time, that use belongs to biography, not to the poem itself. As poetry, it must be treated as an end in itself. Its true order lies in its idea, not in temporal accident. Equally powerless is the purely literary method when it tries to define this work. It cannot even give it a stable name. Is it epic, lyric, dramatic, tragedy, or comedy? What is it? It has been called all of these, and yet it is none of them in a strict sense. Those who try to classify it in such terms reveal a kind of helplessness that becomes evident after repeated attempts. It refuses to be placed under any familiar category because it is itself and nothing else. It cannot be fitted into established rules of poetic form, since it creates its own rules as it unfolds, often in defiance of precedent. As a creative work, it makes its own law and lives its own life within that law. It is an unusually independent book, not only traveling its own path but, to a great extent, creating the path as it moves. Too independent, as the critical surveyor discovers when he arrives with his ancient measuring line, trying to map it onto familiar routes. Yet the work refuses such measurement. As a result, most literary critics, German, English, French, have never fully found themselves at home within it, while the deeper spirit of the age continues to draw closer to it. Despite praising certain parts, they often reject essential elements, showing that they are lost within the greater structure. Or, having wandered through the vast Gothic form, they retreat from its overwhelming scale into some small chamber where a modest window lets in limited light. The problem is clear. They do not possess within themselves the standards by which the poem can be judged, though they believe they do. Thus they attempt to condemn the great book while imagining themselves as judges at a final literary tribunal. One is almost led to ask them, if you do not possess the law of this work, by what means will you judge it? The answer must be that no meaningful judgment is possible in such a case. The law must first be learned, and that law can be learned only from the work itself, which must be its own legislator. If it is truly original, it cannot accept a ready-made law brought from outside by human authority. The philosophic method, while capable of being the best interpreter of Faust, carries within itself the equal possibility of becoming the worst. In it lies the constant danger of fastening upon the poem some external theory that does not belong to the poem itself, but is taken instead from the interpreter's preferred philosophical system. In such a case, the poem turns into a secret hieroglyph, unintelligible to those not initiated into that system, a new form of picture writing still shaded by an old Egyptian darkness. All German philosophies, without exception perhaps, have at one time or another been applied to Faust in a more or less external manner by enthusiastic followers. The Hegelian school, in particular, has shown deep sympathy with the poem, offering some of its strongest interpretations and rightly emphasizing its intellectual side. Yet from the same source have also come some of the most extreme distortions. When Hegelians attempt to treat Faust as a poetic rendering of their master's system, or when they force the order and development of the poem into the categories of Hegelian logic, the result becomes a violence done to the work itself, a distortion that bends it into a kind of monstrosity, as if its very structure were being broken apart. At the same time, it is undeniable that certain scenes bear a striking resemblance to Hegel's thought and even to his manner of expression, and in those cases such comparison offers real insight. It would also be blindness to deny that Faust, in its movement of negation, shows an analogy to the dialectical motion of Hegel's logic. Yet the two works, though existing in the same intellectual world, remain fundamentally separated. Each stands through itself and not through the other, unfolding according to its own law. Similar analogies may be drawn by enthusiastic readers between Faust and various philosophers, both ancient and modern. Spinoza, to whom Goethe acknowledged deep intellectual debt, Schelling, who engaged closely with the poem, even Plato. Yet despite such comparisons, the work remains itself alone, absorbing everything introduced into it without losing its own identity. It is not constructed on any pre-existing system of thought, even though it may incorporate and transform many systems within its movement. A single brick is not the building, nor is the brickmaker the architect. The critic who tries to reduce the poem to any external system reveals that his attention is fixed not on the work itself, but on something outside it, an error that undermines true interpretation. This is a schema of interpretation that Sinder uses in his commentary. Even though he is a Hegelian philosopher, he does not impose Hegelianism in unnecessary way to distort the meaning, but at the same time he does not reject it in places where it can be properly applied, which will be clear throughout this analysis of Faust. In this introduction, I decided to include this interpretive schema by Sinder because I believe this will help us to better understand his commentary, and it will help us in creating a proper introductory perspective before we begin our exploration of the text itself. Sinder continues by stating that this tendency of imposing various unnecessary meanings upon the work is not limited to philosophy. Theology, surprisingly, has also claimed Faust for itself, especially in relation to its treatment of the devil, and different theological schools have entered into disputes over this claim. Protestant interpreters have long regarded the poem as their own, seeing it as a kind of final Protestant utterance in Europe, reviving the spirit of the Reformation in a new mythic form. Catholic interpreters, however, point back to the older legend of Theophilus as the source of the Faust tradition, emphasizing the Catholic elements of the poem, particularly in the Margaret episode and in the medieval and Dante-like tones of the final scenes of the second part, with its imagery drawn from church fathers, saints, and the Virgin. As a result, interpretations multiply under titles such as Goethe as Protestant or Goethe as Catholic, or even the ambiguous designation Goethe as crypto-Catholic, a category into which Shakespeare has also sometimes been placed. Yet such labeling provokes a natural protest. The work should be taken as nature and genius produced it, without being covered over by endless interpretive labels and external classifications. These labels, in truth, are of little concern to the poem itself. Still, it must be admitted that each of these interpretations contains some foundation. Each perspective finds within the work what it seeks and can cite genuine textual support. The poem undeniably contains a deep religious substrate that frequently surfaces in its movement, rising at both beginning and end between earth and heaven, with its prologue and epilogue framed in a higher spiritual realm. The entire work is thus suspended, like humanity itself, between two eternities, before and after. Moreover, Mephisto, consistently identified with the devil throughout the poem, inevitably draws theological interpretation. In this sense, theological readings are not without ground, yet the poem remains itself, neither Catholic nor Protestant, though it contains many strands of both, woven into the fabric of time. Other labels, such as allegorical or symbolic, have also been applied to the work as a whole. Yet it is neither purely allegory nor purely symbolism, though both are present as living elements within its structure. The poem is itself, moving according to its own law in its own world, while absorbing many smaller realms into its course. It is a vast form that takes in other forms, transforms them into its own substance, and thereby remains an original work, comparable only to itself and resting upon itself. From this point, however, another danger must also be noted, opposite but equally serious: the reaction from imperfect interpretation into the denial of all interpretation. Because the poem is not an exposition of Platonic, Hegelian, purely philosophical, or purely theological ideas, one must not conclude that it contains no idea at all. Such a conclusion would amount to the spiritual destruction of the work itself. In that case, the interpreter becomes a denier, a Faust denying Faust. On the contrary, The poem has an idea, and this idea is its own. Not the philosophy of any given master is present here. Not Spinoza's, not Schelling's, not Hegel's, assuredly not Schopenhauer's, which the last shuffle of the philosophic kaleidoscope would have us behold in Faust. Still, it must be said, though it be a poem, it has, like everything else under the sun, its own philosophy, its own ground of existence. Burn up the excrescences in the fires of criticism, if desired, but let it not shrivel the heart of the work. The first duty of the interpreter may be declared to be the unfolding of this idea, or the genetic thought, which moves through, and indeed creates the poem. Thereby true help may be given to the reader to unfold himself into this thought, as it works and weaves its poetical world. Still it must never be forgotten that the poem is its own final expression, and that every other attempt to state it or to explain it is an aid simply, an usher to conduct the stranger before the lord of the castle, by no means itself the lord thereof. Let not that usher presume too much, relying possibly on guilt trappings, else it will be discharged on the spot. It has become the common habit, cousin to egotism on one side, and to indolence on the other, of many people and of many critics, when they see thought developed out of a poem or other work of art, to take for granted that this thought is read into the work from the outside, and is an intrusion upon it. Now such may be the case, as is known and has been seen in a number of instances. Against such a proceeding let the thunderbolt with all its prongs of fire be hurled. But the opposite and greater mistake must also be avoided, that no poem has ever an idea or thought, and that all exposition showing the same is but impertinence, a forcing upon the work some notion alien to it and unwelcome. The balance, the golden balance of moderation, or rather of truth, must be kept. Not all brains are to be thrown away because a maggot is found in some. The great poem has, then, an idea, but it has also a structure, or system, great in proportion to its greatness. This structure or system is its own, not that of any philosophy or theology. It is the very framework which holds it together inwardly and outwardly, and must be seen evolving itself with the poem, an inherent part of its economy, not an external scheme thrust upon it. In Faust are found some of the mightiest sweeps, as well as some of the subtlest refinements of the architecture of human writing. The work cannot be truly understood without following carefully the grand architectonic masses on the one hand, and the intricate structural details on the other. A true criticism must first point out, then move on these lines of structure. Thus the anatomy blooms into life. Yet the double danger still appears here also. First, of imposing upon the poem some philosophic or theologic structure other than its own, and secondly, of denying that it has any structure at all which can be unfolded out of itself. Neither extreme must be taken. One must proceed from the incomplete thing to the complete, never turning back from the incomplete thing, because it is incomplete, to nothing, which is the soul's death. Balance must be kept still, level-headed companion, even while sailing through Scylla and Charybdis. Too much credulity or too much skepticism must not throw the voyager upon the monsters of the deep. A contract is then made, or rather a creed is formed for guidance in this business. The seekers of Faust shall have no idea, no system, not Plato's, not Hegel's, not Stephen Pearl Andrews. They shall take only that of the poem. No philosophy or theology shall be believed in other than that of the poem. They shall not be heathen, nor even Christian in reading this book. They shall be what it is, see what it sees, sleep where it sleeps, live its life, die its death, their idea its idea, their system its system, their soul its soul. Amen. In this pious mood, the mind naturally turns to some authority to lean upon, and so attention is directed toward the poet himself, interrogating him through his writings in reference to this matter. He is found often speaking, in his letters and elsewhere, of the idea of an artistic work. Indeed, he speaks of the idea of this very Faust, so to his mind it must have had an idea. Yet there are also strong counterstatements, which at times appear to amount to a denial of an idea in his work, and his known aversion to having his Faust strung on the string of an abstract idea. Thus the poet seems at discord with himself, sending forth two diverse notes, but closer attention reveals harmony at bottom. By this abstract idea, so repugnant to him, he means some idea foreign to the poem, taken from some other source than the poetic source, often forced into that alien channel. Very justly he revolted at seeing his self-contained work hung up like Siegfried on the peg of some philosophic or theologic system. Against such a method indignation is also demanded from the reader. Still, the idea of the poem, the independent, self-unfolding idea, is something the poet both spoke of and believed in, though many critics have assumed denial of all idea simply because he rejected a bad or inadequate idea. But it is the critic, not Goethe, who leaps into the fire when finding a bug in his bed. It must therefore be repeated that this thought, like the repetition of sunrise, brings daylight into Faust. It is an original book, determined within itself by itself, having its own standard taken from itself, and not from any philosophic, theologic, or ethical system. Still, strands of all these methods of thinking are present, each expressing phases of its truth. It is original not by flinging itself out of the universe, but by resuming the universe into its harmony. In this grand masquerade of poetic forms within Faust, it is not easy to keep one's head always straight. Even the best critic, with the most open soul, may become askew, not only through excess but through omission. Too little stress may be laid on one form, too much on another, and the whole begins to move away. It must not be forgotten that Goethe poured 60 years of Protean life into this poem. It is not easy to grasp or hold him without some of his experience. What a play of forms, half natural and half supernatural, with a tone profoundly secular yet deeply religious, and its two main threads, Faust and Mephisto, man and devil, weaving together into one garment of the sensible and supersensible worlds. The texture of the poem is a texture of marvels, an adventurous epical wanderer like Ulysses, manifold lyric chords, and nearly every variety of lyric form in its many meters, yet its fundamental form is dramatic, though not drama in the old sense. It is a drama playing in the human mind as well as in human deed, a soul drama as well as a world drama. It is also comedy, for Mephistopheles, in the full sweep of his purpose and action, is a comic character, the devil as world's humorist. Yet it is tragedy as the poet names it, though in a new non-Shakespearean sense. Faust, who performs the guilty deed, is compelled to live until he performs the good deed, when he dies. A strange evangel, yet one in which a deeper harmony moves from present struggle toward future birth. Margaret also perishes, surrendering herself to punishment for the guilty deed, yet in that very act of perishing she is saved. To lose her life is to save it. A new tragedy indeed, yet with ancient roots in human history, now sprouting again toward a new world that reaches beyond life and cancels death through death. It becomes evident that Faust cannot be derived from or confined within any treatise of poetic. Such a work creates a new science of criticism, or demands its reconstruction. The waters are out, landmarks submerged or swept away. Meanwhile, the critic complains that it ought not to have rained, as if he knew better than Providence itself. Yet the flood has come, and the task is to adjust thought to the new condition. Thus a new criticism, or reconstruction of criticism, must accompany every appearance of the great book of song. A system of poetic, with Aristotle as precursor, must be drawn from original works of poetry, from the literary Bibles of the race, and the highest original work of poetry carries its own poetic within itself, not derived from any earlier system. This is the final reason for its originality, being self-originating and unfolding from its own germinal idea. Yet it must not be concluded that such a work stands isolated in literature. Rather it includes and resumes earlier works, developing them into a new poetic realm. The true original genius does not break from the universe, but carries it forward, not imitating the old but transforming it into the new, wherein lies its originality. The great and quite universal mistake of the critics on Faust has been that they assume they already possess the canons of judgment for the work, canons derived from antecedent poems and treatises on poetry. Or they take the matter more easily, and assume that heaven has endowed them at birth with what they call good taste, a complete equipment for final decision in literary matters. Such prodigies may have been born, but they are born too late. It is well known that nearly all great original works have had to make their way against the good taste of their time, represented chiefly by professional critics, who assume they possess the rules of all composition and need only apply them in external fashion, accepting or rejecting according to tally. Doubtless there is a field, a vast field, for this kind of criticism. It suffices for poems of the second class, still great, very great, even original in minor points, though in the grand essential point they are imitations, derivations, rehabilitations. It must therefore be proclaimed in full sunlight that the critic as such, deriving professional skill from past reading and study, however acute in judging works of the second, third, and lower classes, is wholly incompetent to detect a work of the first class, simply because it is original and lies outside his horizon. As far as good models go, he may judge with success, but the original book has no model, not even a good one. In reading it, the critic seems set down in a dark wood, where the straight way is lost, and the only thing left him is to damn the forest, though it be a growth of God's own planting. Still, the great bulk of literature is open to him, being largely repetition of what has gone before. The literary Bible, which defies him, comes only once in centuries. Such a book is like a new era breaking into the established order with commotion and irregularity, a revolution which cannot be peacefully subsumed under the ancient state and old law, but which continues revolutionizing until it is subsumed under itself and its own law, when quiet may return until the next jubilee. At this point, Sinder notes a few examples of what he considers to be mistakes made by those who interpreted and wrote commentary on Faust before him. Loper says that Vischer's mistake in judging Faust is that the critic has in mind the ideal of a philosophic tragedy in civil life. Thus he persists in measuring Goethe's work by a standard brought and applied on his own authority, presuming to know better than the creator how the work ought to be made. This is indeed Vischer's mistake. He comes with a preconceived view derived from aesthetic science, which is too small to contain Goethe's poem, though expanded into an aesthetic library of several large volumes. The same mistake appears in Kostlin, Vischer's pupil, who takes Faust as a text for displaying his subjectivity, yet he proceeds to measure and condemn the great book, in mortal fear lest he admire too much, and no fear at all lest his yardstick be short. The same error belongs to the aesthetic school as a whole, which assumes possession of a pre-established scheme for drama or poem, foreordained from the beginning, so that every work must conform to it. Upon this scheme every free literary growth is placed, to test whether it fits, the scheme rather than the poem being treated as authoritative, a procedure tolerable for secondary works, but disastrous for original production. It is evident that this method of the aesthetic school runs parallel to that of the philosophic and theologic schools. Each unconsciously assumes its own standard, and each assails the others for the same fault it itself commits. Indeed, Schelling, always to be mentioned with reverence, approaches the same mistake when he calls Faust Aristophanish comic in the vein of Aristophanes. Yet Faust is also tragic in the vein of Aeschylus. It is both, yet neither in any final sense. It is itself, and cannot be measured by any foreign rule. Even Loper, clear-sighted and many-sided as he is, cannot fully persuade with his designation, calling it an Aristophanic fantastic tragedy, an awkward but comprehensive title. Still, all such attempts, however partial, have their use. They bring into view some thread or colour in the whole texture that might otherwise escape notice. But what is required is the entire canopy with all its lights and hues, not any single thread, however brilliant. Again it must be said, Faust has its ground of being in itself. Its poetic form is its own, though it suggests and resumes many forms of the past, and it has its own rule, being a self-governed community of the imaginary world. The poem is not lawless because it possesses its own law. The highest value of law is precisely that it is self-legislative. It submits to law, but that law is found within itself and not imposed from outside. Yet the question remains, who are the judges? This is not easily answered. They cannot be clearly identified amid the turbulent rush of daily events in the stream of time. They appear hidden, as if waiting for centuries to pass, voiceless amid the frantic surface of the moment. Still, they exist and are already at work, these mysterious judges. Somewhere in a quiet place sits their court, the supreme court of the ages, with a full bench, to which every original poem, beaten and vilified in all the lower courts, must finally appeal for justice. Neither critic nor public can ultimately grant this justice until the final decision is given, when the work's law is received into the universal statute and comes to govern the world. Usually, however, this verdict arrives only long after the death of the one personally concerned. Only the tombstone may mark his triumph. Fate ensures that there is no personal victory, no gratification of vanity or ambition, not even of faithful labor. All mortal elements must first be burned out in the fire of time, and only the pure eternal part remains, finding expression in that final judgment. This high court is itself only a voice from the ages, hardly a tangible body of mortal judges. Yet it has a definite function, not merely to subsume under some existing law, but to discover the law of the poem, to declare it decisively, and to affirm that this law is final and highest. Then the world, critic and public alike, accepts and obeys this judicial mandate. From that moment the book becomes one of the great books of the human race, a standard for all other works, and a fertile source of imitation, commentary, and reinterpretation. Like all supreme tribunals, this court is slow. It cannot be hurried by eager claimants, even though its docket may be centuries behind amid the immense pressure of cases. Yet the decision comes. Some works are burned to ashes in the slow but certain fire of time, others are purified in that fire into a higher form and seem almost translated into a kind of permanence beyond it. No single individual can render such a verdict, which must be the voice of centuries. Likewise, no individual can overturn it once it has been given. Yet individuals can assist in discovering the law of the poem and giving it form in expression that bridges the work and the common consciousness of humanity, making it a shared possession. The essential principles of the poetic law of Faust are still to be fully grasped by the cultivated world. The poem remains new, at times resistant, at times obscure, breaking many older literary and religious forms and defying established prejudices. Many aspects of its poetic law are still not fully unfolded. There have been many interpretations, philosophical, theological, ethical, aesthetic, but there remains a strong need for those who will see the work objectively, as it is in itself, rather than fitting it into an alien framework. It does have a structure, its own structure, to be derived from itself. It must not be judged lawless simply because its law is internal. Once again appear the familiar dangers, like mythical sea monsters on either side of the passage, Scylla and Charybdis, as if haunting this Faustian sea, ready to swallow the traveller who drifts too carelessly across its waters. Yet one must not flee into chaos upon finding a flaw in the cosmos. The prejudiced often accuse the unprejudiced of the very fault they themselves avoid least, and when a faithful interpretation is offered, its author is accused of imposing a foreign system upon the poem, though this is precisely what has not been done. It is difficult even for well-meaning and intelligent minds to maintain balance in this matter. Objections to bad method are often extended into rejection of all method, and resistance to imposed external law is mistaken for denial of law altogether. Yet nothing can be done, least of all the writing of a great poem, without some form of order, and the greater the work, the more perfect its order. People may deny all system while unconsciously using system in their denial, their actions contradicting their words. Law must belong to the thing itself, even if discovered and expressed by another. Gravitation remains nature's law even when named by Newton. The faithful interpreter must therefore expect, when giving any positive account of the poem's order, to be accused by skeptical critics of committing the very fault he has rejected. Yet he should not lose heart, for like the poem itself, he must endure misunderstanding and hardship in proportion to the worth of his effort. Such resistance may even be encouragement, since it is part of the discipline of the work, and perhaps a sign of its lasting value. In the end, it too must appeal to that supreme tribunal whose justice determines the world order. The poem carries not only a German or even a European importance, but a world historical significance, and its ultimate meaning can be approached only from that highest standpoint. Outside Germany, much of what is written about Faust in German scholarship offers limited interest or relevance. The historical and antiquarian details drawn from it are necessary and useful, and many ideas, especially those of the great philosophers on Faust, possess genuine German universality and real fertility of thought. Yet much of this material remains local, tied to disputes, literary circles, and shifting fashions, bound up with competing schools and intense partisanships that generate endless refutations and counter-refutations, until the discourse itself seems to flow like a continuous stream of print alongside time, threatening to fill infinite space with books, burdensome accumulations of negation fit only to be cast into oblivion. A large portion of this vast accumulation cannot be carried across the sea, nor even across the more navigable waters toward lands beyond the Atlantic. Gratitude is nevertheless due to those from whom such inheritance has come, for among their gifts stands Faust itself. Yet the standpoint required cannot be local, factional, national, or even merely European. It must be world historical, or else it sinks into mere repetition and imitation of what has already been. From the perspective of an Aryan literary inheritance, Faust stands as one of the literary Bibles, rising from national literature into world literature. From this perspective alone can its true significance be understood, studied, and ultimately judged. Yet Faust must not be viewed only in isolation. It has a past and a future. Behind it lies a long and noble ancestry. It must be seen as part of the family of literary Bibles that form the poetic record of Europe's destiny. It is the latest of these works, and in a sense gathers them together again, carrying them forward in a kind of spiritual continuation. Its full meaning can be grasped only by a vision that traces the entire line back to Homer, and perceives the unfolding development that culminates in Faust as the central growth of literary spirit. In this way, not through national sentiment but through world historical judgment, those on the Western continent, though heirs of Europe, must regard these works as part of a universal inheritance. Such a perspective gives rise to a new criticism, positive rather than negative, constructive rather than destructive, born from the great books of world literature and itself capable of interpreting their lore without distortion or denial. A criticism of this kind would be as universal as its subject, able to present world literature as a coherent whole. The new critic would emerge with time, not merely as critic, but as a kind of priest of literature, interpreting the literary Bibles for understanding and guidance. In Faust, then, one may see the most complete image of its own age, and in the fact that an age can cast such an image of itself lies its highest expression and culmination. The book stands like a heaven-reaching peak set in German soil, rising into the sky of world literature, visible to all who choose to see and to be guided through their earthly wanderings. No one needs to travel to Germany to encounter it. Its proportions may even be better grasped from a distance, since perspective in space and time reveals what is large and conceals what is small. As with great monuments such as St. Peter's at Rome, no immediate vantage point can fully convey its scale. Distance alone brings clarity. From afar, lesser structures vanish, while the great form remains distinct and commanding. At this point, Sinder, in this very commentary of his, points out how it is therefore likely that some reader may object in frustration, asking why such commentary should stand between them and the poem itself. The answer is simple. For such a reader, the commentary has no purpose, for they already live in direct intimacy with the work. It may be set aside or even destroyed, for its task is only to introduce those who do not yet know the poem, in the hope that acquaintance may grow into lasting understanding. For those already beyond that stage, it has no function, it need not be read further. The author is also not exempt from a certain inward protest against his own labor, often asking himself in a somewhat weary or even irritable tone why so much time and strength of life, something of real worth to him, should be spent in writing a long commentary on a book in a foreign tongue. Yet this inner question finds its firm answer, because Faust is a literary Bible, standing among the supreme musical utterances of humanity alongside Homer, Dante, and Shakespeare. And the literary Bible, in modern times as much as the religious Bible, requires interpreters, those who feel called to unfold its highest literary meaning for others who have not had the opportunity to understand it fully, yet desire and ought to know it for the sake of their inner development. What the work discloses about human life, what it reveals of human destiny in this world and beyond, is what the interpreter must present according to his capacity. Only in this sense does such criticism have any real importance. To merely consume poetry as refined enjoyment is the act of a sensualist, however cultivated, turning into a lotus eater forgetful of home, duty, and action. This must not be done if there is any belief in the higher vocation of literature. The task is not to collect beautiful passages or admire style and language with idle delight. That would be a trivial occupation fit only for a literary dandy or follower of fashionable taste. The proper role is that of a priest, if such calling exists within, belonging to the great hierarchy of literature whose essence is expressed in the literary Bibles. Otherwise, it would be better to labor honestly upon the earth for one's sustenance. Thus the heart, which cannot always be restrained in its sudden expressions, even if they come out of rhythm or measure, may return again to its silent inner place and continue its unseen work. Yet there remains another duty, one that must be expressed: the effort to interpret Faust from within itself, to unfold its idea and structure through commentary, and to show the poem as governed by its own law. Whether this has been accomplished or even begun can be judged by the audience in what follows, though it will require diligence and attention. The task of Faust is not easy, and it should not be approached as mere entertainment or as a means of pleasing imagination with external poetic display. Its meaning is far deeper. It demands the best and most attentive moments of the mind. It rejects the worn-out remnants of the day and the exhausted hours of fatigue. The great book insists on being treated as a serious matter, perhaps one of the most serious among human concerns. Otherwise it remains silent like the Sphinx, or speaks only in riddles. A broad and expansive range of understanding is required for its proper grasp. It must be seen as the final original product of a powerful spiritual movement that gave rise to the Western world and expresses itself in what may be called West-Aryan literature. Faust stands as one of its 4 great literary Bibles, works so significant that they are called Bibles because they form a parallel spiritual stream to the religious Bible, which flows from the Semitic East. Nature, but rather deepens it. To comprehend a poem does not stand in the way of its enjoyment. Another frequent mistake may be noticed here. When the scheme or plan of a work is pointed out, it is often claimed that there can then be no inspiration in it, as if all thinking excluded spontaneity. But thought is just as spontaneous as an image or a feeling, a sudden revelation from unfathomed depths. It is commonly assumed that in great intellectual structure there can be little heart work, yet in the complete human being, especially in genius, the two belong together and condition one another. The head must think and shape the great design, which inspiration fills to overflowing. Both move together and are at root one, separating only when they become incomplete or one-sided. Thought and spontaneity form a true union in poetic creation, and in the supreme act of creation itself, God must be conceived as possessing the greatest head in harmony with the greatest heart, so that the universe arises from deepest thought and deepest inspiration together. Otherwise, it could not be the universe. In this study, the matter must be approached directly with one's own God-given eyes, testing everything pointed out by them. What they perceive must be seen without distortion, neither through the lens of any external system imposed on the poem, nor through a blind fear of system that refuses all structure and leaves the mind groping in darkness on the Faust journey. Both prejudices must be cast away, the prejudice of system and the prejudice of no system, for both are equally narrow and harmful to honest inquiry. An open and unbiased spirit is required, not infallible, but capable of correcting itself, revealing man as the self-correcting animal. The organism of the first part must then be observed, with its points of transition carefully traced and ordered. A careful reader will feel a decisive shift at the scene known as Auerbach's cellar, a sign of an important structural change. At this point Faust leaves his study and enters the world. After a long internal struggle from which Mephisto has been generated, he now moves into an external realm where new conflict awaits him, accompanied by his diabolic guide. The reader is invited to verify this directly from the poem. If it cannot be confirmed, then agreement must end here. If it can be confirmed, the movement continues toward a second major transition, where Faust, after a great experience of the world under Mephisto's guidance, subdues him and turns him into an instrument for the attempted rescue of Margaret. Thus the drama forms 3 great masses: Mephisto-generated, Mephisto-dominant, and Mephisto-subservient, marking the sweep of evil from its origin, through its rule, to its partial subjection. A brief scheme of the first part may now be set down, marking these structural joints so that the organism of the work remains visible. The critic who rejects such diagrams may claim they arise from inner invention rather than the poem itself, insisting that no such structure exists because he has not seen it. Such a critic is always ready with negation, having little else to offer. He should not be heeded, for he is essentially a denier. His understanding does not extend to where Faust truly begins, and in his present condition he cannot enter it. The scheme must be tested against the text. If it is wrong, it should be replaced with a better one. But one must beware of anyone who empties the soul into nothingness, lest he end by reducing everything to zero. The first part of Faust may therefore be divided into three principal sections. The internal movement, the struggle within Faust between intelligence that denies truth and aspiration that affirms truth. This theoretical denial generates Mephisto, from the first soliloquy to Auerbach's cellar. The external movement, Faust's aspiration engaged in conflict with a negative, distorted world into which he is led by Mephisto. This is practical denial, expressed not only in individual action but in the structure of the world itself. From Auerbach's cellar to the scene called Gloomy Day. The final movement, Faust subordinates Mephisto and compels him to assist in the attempted rescue of Margaret, who ultimately rejects external salvation but attains inner reconciliation and forgiveness to the end. These divisions will form the chapters of the study. Before proceeding, however, the introduction of the poet must first be considered, and this introduction, which consists of dedication, prologue in theatre, and prologue in heaven, will be the theme of our next video.